Alrighty, let's get a little bit more technical here now in day two. Let's just jump straight in, shall we? So today we're going to be talking all about gear, about sensors and different sizes, about different camera types, which to buy, what kind of systems to invest in, and all that real kind of technical stuff. And let's start off with the core component to any camera, the sensor. So as we learned yesterday, camera lenses attach onto camera bodies and focus the image onto the sensor inside the camera body. But not all camera bodies are created equal. Your phone, which has a teeny camera just like this, so small, can take great photos. But then sometimes you might see a professional take photos with something that looks more like this. What's the difference? Why is this worth paying 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times more in some cases than a smartphone? Well, when it comes to the sensor itself, there are two main reasons you need to concern yourself with right now at this stage of the game, at the beginning of your journey. And those two things are size and resolution. Let's talk about size first. Now, when we talk about sensor sizes, we need to have a very brief mention about the old technology of film. Now, to keep things very simple and not dive into the very wild and wacky world of film and all of its different types, know that there are many different types of film. Like literally like way too many to mention. Of those, there was one particular size of film that was widely used due to its portability, size, and convenience amongst many other factors. And that was the 35mm film. 35mm film gets its name from the total width of 135 film, and each frame within this roll of film was 24mm by 36mm. And typically in a roll of 35mm film, you would have 12, 24, or 36 shots per roll. Now, all of this isn't all that important in today's digital world, but what you need to know is this magical 35mm number, because 35mm is the standard that we base sizes off of. In today's digital world, sensors with what we refer to as full frame, like what is in this camera and what is in this camera over here, resemble the 35mm number in terms of the surface area of the sensor. Think of it as like full frame sensor being 100%, the standard size, which is equal to 35mm. Now, why is this important? Well, this full frame is our baseline when we're talking about the sizes of sensors. And there are so many different cameras that have sensor sizes that are smaller than full frame to consider. Common formats are APS-C, Micro Four Thirds, 1 inch, and then smaller than 1 inch, which is what you'll typically find on phones. Now here is where it kind of gets a little bit tricky. If we use the full frame size as 100%, we call full frame 100, we have a way to be able to distinguish and to label sensor sizes that are smaller than full frame. In photography, we do this by what's called a crop factor. The crop factor is the representation of the sensor size relative to the full frame size. So perhaps the most common crop factor sensor size is what's called APS-C, which is 1.5 times smaller than a full frame sensor in terms of its physical size. So we can then refer to the APS-C size as having a 1.5 times crop factor. Another common crop factor size is called Micro Four Thirds, or MFT. And that sensor size is about 2 times smaller than a full frame sensor. Another common size is the 1 inch sensor, which is about 2.7-ish times smaller than a full frame sensor. Now, this is all important to note because photography is all about light. And the sensor in a camera is the thing that does the light gathering, that collects the light. The more surface area of that sensor there is available, then the more light that sensor is then able to gather. You know, much like solar panels on a roof, the more panels you have, the more surface area and potential light those panels can then absorb. But for now, know that the larger sensor that you have, the more light it's then able to gather, meaning less noise and less grain, and the ability for a shallower depth of field, or what's called bokeh, that really nice out of focus blur. And it usually means more things like, more sharpness and better color and, a bunch of other different effects that smaller sensors just don't get to benefit from. And don't worry, if you don't know what any of those terms mean, that's totally fine. We'll cover them soon enough. Now, the other important thing to talk about here when it comes to sensor sizes just in general is resolution. Now, resolution determines how big the image will end up being when you take the image. We refer to how big the image will end up being in what's called megapixels. The higher the number, the more megapixels, and each megapixel is 1 million pixels. For example, 1080p or 1920 by 1080 pixel resolution is 2,073,600 pixels, which is roughly about 2 megapixels. 4K, like the quality I hope most of you will be watching this course in right now, is 3840 by 2160 pixels, which is around 8 megapixels. And when you make a post on Instagram, that comes out to around 1.5 megapixels. In a smartphone, usually the sensors that they use will come out to around 12 megapixels as well. In a dedicated camera, we have all sorts of megapixel counts. We have 20 megapixel cameras, 33 megapixel cameras, 42, 50, 60, even 100 and over. Now, note that resolution itself is not exclusively tied to the size of the sensor itself. On a full frame camera, you can get 12 megapixel cameras and you can get, 100 megapixel cameras. So just note that things like sharpness or color or low light performance or any of that is not specifically tied at all to a specific megapixel count. It's all relative to that particular device. So make sure to do your research. In terms of a buying decision, as we'll talk about shortly, typically for general use for most people, anywhere between 12 to 24 megapixels is more than enough for most people. While you can do pretty much anything at any normal megapixel number, if you do intend on printing your images often, then you might want to consider a higher megapixel count so that they can stay sharp as you blow them up onto your walls. Remember, the more megapixels you have, the larger and the sharper the image is going to be at a larger size. However, with modern technology and Photoshop these days, there are ways to make a 12 megapixel phone camera shot, big and sharp enough for you to print on an A1 print. So, do with that information what you will. All right, now that we understand about sensor sizes and resolution, it now begs the question, what do you buy? Right? There's so many options out there. And of course, it's tough to give a true recommendation without truly knowing like how much budget you have to spend and what type of person you are and what's important to you. For example, I'm the kind of guy who will get into a hobby and buy the most expensive top tier thing right out the gate just so that I don't have to keep upgrading. But not everyone is like me. Many people start off with just their phones and see if they like the hobby of photography to even begin with. Some people start in the middle with APS-C cameras and, test the waters and then work their way up. Whichever way you decide to do it is totally up to you. There is no right or wrong answer because you can take fantastic photos with any camera that you have. And, throughout this course, I'll be arming you with the skills and the skill set to be able to do so. But I will do my best to give you at least some recommendations at least. And let's start at the very top. Full frame. Typically, professionals and hardcore enthusiasts will go for a full frame camera. With full frame, you'll typically have all of the pro features like amazing autofocus, full-on weather sealing, the best low light performance, all the latest tech and so on, but you'll also have the price to match. Sometimes these cameras can go from $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 just for the body alone. They're pretty hardcore, but if you've got the money to invest in full frame straight up, then that really means that you're not going to be upgrading anytime soon, if at all. An example from the Sony line of cameras are the Alpha 7 series of full frame cameras. The A7 Mark II, 3, and 4 and above are fantastic entry-level full frame hybrid cameras. They have pro-level features and can do both photo and video very well. The A7S or sensitivity series of cameras have lower resolution but fantastic low light performance, meaning that they're great for video. And the A7R or resolution series of cameras are more photography focused with an insane amount of resolution, like 42 megapixels, 60 megapixels, and so on. And from there, the very top of the line is the Alpha 1, having 50 megapixels and being the best professional full-frame hybrid camera for both photo and video that Sony has to offer. Now, keep in mind that this is specifically how Sony decides to separate their product lineup, and no other manufacturer really labels their cameras in this way, and every manufacturer is different. So when you decide on a manufacturer, make sure to do your research on how the product lines are split up. Next, we have APS-C, and this is typically where I see most people starting at when they're getting into photography for the first time. So APS-C cameras have a great blend of performance and price. They are the mid-tier, and while they won't have all of the pro-level features or the best low-light quality, they're usually smaller and lighter and cheaper, and even pros tend to have APS-C cameras as backups because of how capable they can be. And now, this is a great time to point something out. Almost all of the big camera manufacturers, Sony, Canon, Nikon, etc., they all have an APS-C offering and a full-frame offering. But a thing to point out here to potentially save you a lot of money down the road is to consider what lens mount these bodies have. We'll talk more about lenses tomorrow, but know that for now, APS-C bodies will typically have a range of APS-C lenses to go along with them, which are smaller, lighter, cheaper than their full-frame counterparts for sure. Conversely, full-frame bodies will also have full-frame lenses, which are also heavier, but more sharp and more expensive as well. It's more and more common nowadays for manufacturers to have one way to mount these lenses across both APS-C and full-frame offerings, right? This is so that one single manufacturer can get you to stay with the same brand as you upgrade from APS-C to full frame. For example, in Sony, they have what's called the E-mount, and all APS-C E-mount lenses can go onto APS-C full frame bodies and vice versa. But okay, here's where it gets complicated. So go over this next section a few times if you have to, if it's a little bit more confusing for you. If we recall that APS-C is 1.5 times smaller than full frame, if you put an APS-C lens onto a full frame body, you're putting a smaller lens size onto a bigger sensor. It'll physically fit because the mounting is the same, but the full frame body will only be able to show you the APS-C lens size it was designed for. So a 20mm APS-C lens, when put on a full frame body, will have the equivalent focal length of 30mm because 20mm times 1.5 equals 30. Again, this is because the smaller APS-C lens is smaller than a full frame lens. The field of view is inherently smaller. However, purchasing a full frame size lens and then using an APS-C body, so the other way around in this example, that works as well. But the good thing about this way around is that if you buy a full frame size lens but use an APS-C size body, when you are ready to then upgrade your body to a full frame body in the future, you can still use that full frame lens if you bought one, and you can still get the full field of view because the lens is bigger and it was designed for full frame. And this adaptability and transferability between different sensor sizes, within the same mounting system is, something that is really interesting that every camera manufacturer offers. And it is something to keep in mind when you make your purchase decisions in terms of like longevity and how much money you do want to spend down the line. So again, just to really explain this concept, here's an example. This is a 85mm full frame lens and a full frame body. Now, I personally don't use APS-C, but let's say that this setup here is an APS-C lens. It's smaller, right? And let's say it's also 85mm, but let's say that this is an APS-C body as well. Now, the APS-C 85 on an APS-C body will shoot an 85mm focal length, right? APS-C body, APS-C lens. This full frame 85 on a full frame body will shoot 85mm as well, a full frame lens on a full frame body. Now, this is because both the lenses and the sensor sizes are made for each other, but both camera systems share the same mounting system, so these lenses are interchangeable. Now, when you take this APS-C lens and you put it onto a full frame body, it physically fits and you can use it and it's great. But because it's an APS-C lens, it was designed to focus light onto a smaller sensor. So when this goes onto a full frame sensor, remember that the APS-C lens has a crop factor of 1.5, meaning that what I see on this full frame camera is effectively 1.5 times more zoomed in, which is 127.5 millimeters. Conversely, when I take this full frame 85 millimeter, again, it looks like 85 on the full frame, and it was built for full frame, right? So it's bigger. So when I put this full frame lens on an APS-C body, it fits, it works, it's great, but because the sensor size is smaller here, it can't pick up all of the surrounding area, and therefore, it will be a focal length of that 1.5 times crop factor. All right, that's a lot, and this got really technical really quickly, but this is also as simplified as it gets, and not all of this detail right now is super important at this stage, and it's okay if you didn't understand this example. All you need to know is that different manufacturers have different mounting systems for their lenses, and it pays to be a little bit forward thinking when deciding on which size and which platform to purchase. But for most people, APS-C is a great place to start. Alrighty, the next one is Micro Four Thirds. So Micro Four Thirds is an even smaller version from APS-C, right? Coming in at around 2 times smaller than full frame. And there are brands such as Olympus and Panasonic that swear by this sensor size. For them, a lot of the benefit comes from what's called a smaller flange distance, leading to smaller camera bodies and thus smaller camera lenses as well. Now, this doesn't always necessarily translate to cheaper prices, unfortunately, as you could imagine, as is the case with all manufacturers. But, if size and weight are of the utmost concern to you and APS-C doesn't float your boat, then you have Micro Four Thirds. There is, however, a growing debate over whether MFT and the next sensor size that I'm about to talk about, 1 inch, will eventually become obsolete and eaten up by, the smartphone market. But hey, that's your call, and it's still a fantastic platform to make quality images, and there's still a lot to be found in the MFT space. The next one is 1 inch sensors, and these sensors have a sweet spot in my heart personally. They are most commonly found in point and shoot cameras or other small form factor cameras like this, or in drones. And personally, I love this specific compact camera. This is the Sony RX100. And it is a series of point and shoot compact cameras that is super small, super pocketable, and they produce absolutely amazing images that are better than what any phone can do. And sometimes you can't even tell the difference between, something that is shot on this to something that is shot on the top of the line camera like this, especially if it's shot in good light. And these things are super powerful and super convenient to keep around. Also, the very famous DJI Mavic line of drones have 1 inch sensors as well, which is a great blend of just enough low light performance for most applications and a size and weight reduction that's great for smaller form factors as well. Nowadays, we're slowly seeing phones adopt 1 inch sensors too, and I personally think that this is where the phone industry is actually going to go. Now, note that 1 inch sensors typically don't have interchangeable lenses for them. Usually they're fixed lenses with, cameras and sensors attached to them like this, and you can't change them. Still, if you don't want to invest that much money, but you still want to try your hand at photography and still want the ability to make fantastic images, then maybe a compact camera or a 1 inch sensor might be a good choice for you. Even as a professional photographer myself, I always keep my RX100 on me at all times because you never know when an image will just suddenly pop up. And, I post images on my Instagram all the time from this camera, and some of my favorite images have been taken on this tiny camera. And, so many of my portfolio images are actually shot on this camera as well. So, don't write these things off as just toys. They are most certainly worth your time and worth your dollar. So definitely consider those as well. And then finally, we have phones. And oh boy, Phones really gotten good over the years, especially in like the last 7 years or so, with all of these advances in computational photography and the minification of components and novel ideas reaching their way to the mainstream. It's really quite impressive. In today's world, your phone, especially if it's a top tier one for that year, is nothing to scoff at. Like, these things are really, really good, right? And you could have, and many people have had their entire photography career shot on a phone. Now, of course, you probably don't want to limit yourself to, things like not being able to print large sizes and having average image quality and resolution and limited focal ranges and on and on and on. But honestly, for the convenience that is packed into a phone, something that you have in your pocket all the time, the trade-offs can be worth it depending on, the situation. Now, all this to say, don't be afraid to start photography with just your phone if you just have that, and see whether or not you even like photography from there. There's no shame in not purchasing a proper camera to start with until you figure out if you're serious enough to drop some serious money on something else. But when it comes to purchasing a phone, whether that's an iPhone or something from Samsung or Google or anything else, usually, their pro versions are usually the higher tier versions, and those versions also have better cameras most of the time. So when it's time to consider your next upgrade cycle and your next phone, and you want to explore photography just a little bit more, then consider just getting the premium version of that phone, and it may take you a lot further. Also, make sure to find an app that allows you to shoot in the RAW format as well, which we'll get into more in the coming days. But doing so and finding those settings will allow you to make the most out of the images that you are taking. Now, the great advantage of the phone is that they're so convenient. The default quality is not bad, I guess. It's good. It's good enough, not great. But it's more than good enough for most applications, certainly for most people nowadays, posting to Instagram, sharing with friends, using online and taking notes and all those kind of things. But the disadvantages of phones in general are usually that, there are certain things that computational photography just can't solve right now. A full frame sensor is, or can be, over three times larger than a phone sensor. And, oftentimes, the quality in terms of color reproduction, depth, noise performance, and resolution is often way more than 3 times better than what a phone can do when compared to, even the top line of phone cameras nowadays. And in most cases, you just can't beat physics, right? Full frame sensors are just bigger, period. And we haven't developed the technology to combat that just yet. That being said, advancements are being made every single year. So, definitely consider using your phone to start with. There's no shame in that again. All right, away from purchasing decisions for the minute right now and on to a little bit more theory and history. So the idea of having a sensor in the camera is one thing, but a camera isn't just about the sensor. A core part of it is the shutter as well. The shutter is the mechanism that sits in front of the sensor and opens and closes in front of it very, very quickly to determine how much light is then allowed onto the sensor to make your exposure. And there have been many advancements in both shutter technology and sensor technology, and knowing which one to get for what purpose can save you a lot of money down the road. The DSLR is the classic camera style that people talk about when they think of professional cameras, or a dedicated camera at least. And this kind of camera is a style that came into popularity immediately after the first one was created in 1999. How it works is that light comes through the lens and it hits what's called a reflex mirror. The mirror sits in front of the sensor and blocks the light coming through to the actual sensor while reflecting the light into a pentaprism and then into a viewfinder. This allows you to see and preview what the composition will look like before you take the image. And then when you really do want to take the image, you press the shutter button and the mirror flips upwards, allowing the light to then pass through onto the sensor rather than getting through onto the viewfinder. And then the shutter quickly opens and closes depending on your shutter speed, and then the mirror quickly flips back down. It's this mirror and shutter that provides the sensor with that brief flash of light that is called your exposure. All of this means that when you are viewing an image through the viewfinder on a DSLR camera, what you're looking at is the optical version of what your camera setup is viewing in that moment. It doesn't account for exposure or how bright or dark your image is. And don't worry, we'll be going over exposure in great detail over the coming days. But because of this, there is a measurement device within the camera called an exposure meter. And this exposure meter helps measure the exposure before you take it, but you'll have to still check whether or not you got the exposure correct after you take every single shot on a DSLR camera. Now, typically, a lot of the beginner cameras will be DSLR cameras. And at this moment, this is where you'll also find the most bargains and the most bang for your buck, especially in the secondary market. And this is because DSLR technology has been replaced by mirrorless technology, and outdated technology always costs less. Now, a big issue with DSLR cameras is that the optical viewfinder means that exposing your images correctly can be troublesome because you still have to check your image every single time that you take one. You have to see whether or not you got the exposure correct after each shot. And this is where newer technology of mirrorless cameras come in and really fix this issue. And as the name implies, mirrorless cameras don't have the complex mirror flapping structure of DSLR cameras, but instead with a mirrorless camera, the light comes through the lens and it hits the sensor directly all of the time. There is still a shutter in front of the sensor to make the exposure and quickly open and close, but the technology of having the light always exposed onto the sensor means that you can preview exposure changes in real time in the viewfinder because the sensor will always be updated to make sure that the changes that you make are what's reflected. This means you never have to check each and every single image. Instead, what you see is what you get. And obviously, this is a ton more easier and way more convenient. The shutter still works in the same way. It still, closes to initiate the exposure, then flashes open and then closed again, depending on your shutter speed. But because of the real-time nature of mirrorless, when you're previewing your images or you're looking through the viewfinder, you're not looking at an optical version of the world. You are looking at a digital one. Now, compared to a DSLR, this has its pros and its cons. One of the cons is that many people prefer the feel of an optical viewfinder because it's real time and because you're actually just looking through glass and seeing it with the naked eye in real life. Whereas in mirrorless, it's actually a display. Whether you're using the viewfinder or the monitor at the back, it's just a display. And it's a representation of what the sensor will capture, and most of the time, that means that it'll have some lag, and that can mean the difference between getting the shot and not, depending on if you're shooting a moving subject or not. And sometimes this can be a little bit disorienting. This has been remedied for the most part for the higher end mirrorless cameras, which can offer frame rates that are much higher than what even the human eye can see at. It's not uncommon to see the higher end stuff offer viewfinder displays that show the world in 120 or even 240 frames per second. Now, my recommendation for DSLR versus mirrorless really depends on your budget. The future is mirrorless, and so if the future extensibility and real-time previewing is really important to you and you have the money to go for it, then go for a mirrorless camera. However, if you're looking for a real bargain or, perhaps you don't yet know if photography is for you and you want more of an analog feel even, then perhaps DSLR is the way to go. Now, we'll add at this point that there is also the option of shooting on film as well, the old school film, right? But I don't really recommend that approach if you're just starting out in photography, just because it's slow and expensive and you don't really grow and learn as fast as you would on digital. And for this reason, I won't be covering it, as I also see that film is more of an advanced kind of thing, and it might be something that you want to dive into later once you learn the basics of photography in digital. All right, assignment time. So today's assignment is about future planning, and it is a 2-part assignment in conjunction with tomorrow's lesson. Now, I really hope you understood everything about sensor sizes and have an idea about purchase decisions, because A little bit of future planning in this area can mean a lot of money saved in the long run. And the longer you want to stay doing photography, the more savings that you can end up having. Now, because of that, I want you to plan ahead. I want you to write out an upgrade path of what gear you have right now and what your next upgrade is going to be, and then what your end game upgrade is going to be from there. This means I want you to pick a camera manufacturer, a mounting system, a sensor size, and do all of your research on the entire line of cameras that that manufacturer has. And then once you understand this line, then you can make your choices. And over the next couple of years, you can then work your way up to upgrading to get that end game gear. Now, this means you won't be, darting off course or making inefficient purchase decisions as you go along, because you'll have a plan, right? You'll know exactly what to do at every step of the way, and you won't waste a single dime. In tomorrow's lesson, we're going to be talking about lenses. So for today, we'll just have bodies in your upgrade path, but tomorrow we'll also include lenses as well. All right, see you tomorrow.